My name is Mara Bennett. I'm 34 years old, a senior marketing manager at Cascade Dynamics in Seattle, Washington, and last spring I realized something that changed everything I thought I knew about love, family, and loyalty. It happened the same week I learned I needed emergency surgery to remove a tumor. That moment, when I was lying in a hospital bed, trembling, terrified, waiting to be wheeled into the operating room, was when I finally understood that the people who should have loved me most had abandoned me completely. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. And if you love stories that reveal the truth behind perfect family photos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing more stories that remind us we're not alone. It started quietly, the way heartbreak always does, with a phone call that didn't sound like the end of anything. I was standing in my kitchen, balancing a bottle in one hand and my phone in the other. The twins, Lily and Pearl, finally asleep in their cribs. The doctor's voice came through steady and calm, like she'd practiced delivering bad news. Mara, we found something during your scan. It's a tumor. We need to operate right away. My first instinct wasn't fear. It was logistics. How would I manage childcare, work deadlines, recovery time? Fear would come later. That's the thing about being the responsible one. You learn to panic in order. I remember looking around my apartment, the half-folded laundry, the untouched dinner on the counter, the baby monitor blinking softly like a heartbeat, and thinking, I can handle this. I always do. That was my mantra, my armor, my curse. But somewhere beneath that calm surface, a quiet dread began to stir. Not about the surgery, but about something I didn't yet have the courage to name. What if no one showed up for me? For most of my life, I'd been everyone's emergency contact. My parents, Elaine and Robert, had always leaned on me when things went wrong. Mortgage overdue, medical bills, the time my sister Tessa's car broke down on the highway and I drove 2 hours just to swipe my card at the mechanic's office. I'd grown used to being the problem solver, the family's unofficial insurance policy. I told myself it was love. That's what daughters do, right? They take care of their own. They make sacrifices. They fill the gaps no one else sees. But deep down, I think I believed that if I gave enough time, money, patience, they'd finally see me as someone worth protecting, not just depending on. That night, after the doctor's call, I wrote down everything that needed to be done. Prepare bottles, pack an overnight bag, find someone to watch the girls while I was in surgery. It was practical, methodical, just another problem to solve. I didn't know yet that the problem wasn't the tumor. It was the people I trusted to care about me. When you become a single mother by choice, you make peace with a lot of things. Loneliness, exhaustion, the quiet ache of wishing someone would notice how hard you're trying. I thought I'd already made that peace. But as I dialed my mother's number the next morning, I felt something close to hope. Surely this time, they'd be there for me. Surely, family means something when your life is on the line. If I could go back, I'd tell that version of me to brace herself. I'd tell her that the people she's about to call won't answer with love or worry or even basic decency. They'll answer with a concert. But that's later. At that moment, I was just a tired woman with dark circles under her eyes, holding a phone that felt heavier than it should have. Before that call, my life looked deceptively stable. On paper, I was the success story. Career on track, twins thriving, bills paid. My colleagues thought I was unstoppable. They didn't see the part where I sent my parents money every month, or how I'd skip my own medical checkups because I couldn't afford time off. They didn't know that every "you're so strong, Mara" felt like another brick in a wall I didn't remember building. I used to believe that love was endurance, that being the strong one was noble, that giving without asking was grace. But strength without reciprocity is just depletion dressed up as virtue. I'd been running on empty for years, and I didn't even notice until that phone call forced me to stop. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain drummed against the windows, a steady rhythm that usually calmed me. I walked into the twins' room, leaned over their cribs, and watched their small chests rise and fall in perfect synchrony. I whispered, "It's going to be okay," even though I wasn't sure I believed it. In that moment, the thought of leaving them, even for a few hours under anesthesia, filled me with a fear so physical I had to sit down. But I also felt something else, an intuition I couldn't shake. A whisper that said, "You can't keep carrying everyone. Someone's about to drop you." I wish I could tell you I ignored it, but I didn't. It lingered like a premonition, a shadow just outside the frame. The next morning, I packed the diaper bag, made formula bottles, and called my parents. My voice shook, though I tried to sound calm. "Mom, I need help. Just for a day. I'm having emergency surgery to remove a tumor." There was a pause, and in that pause, something in me shifted. I didn't know yet what they would say, but my body already did. My stomach turned cold, as if bracing for impact. Looking back, I realized that moment, the silence before their answer, was the true beginning of everything that followed. Because sometimes, it isn't the betrayal that breaks you. It's the moment you realize it was always possible. If you've ever been the one everyone counts on, if you've ever been praised for being the strong one until your strength became invisible, then you already know where this story might go. But you don't know how it ends. Stay with me. Because this isn't just a story about surgery or family drama. It's a story about awakening, about what happens when the caretaker finally says, "No more." And trust me, when you hear what my parents said next, you'll understand why I'll never forget the sound of that phone ringing. Question for you. If you were in Mara's place, would you still call your parents for help? A. Yes, because they're still your family, and you'd hope they'd show up. B. No, because history has already shown you who they are. Comment A or B below and tell me why. I grew up believing that love was a transaction you earned through usefulness. My parents, Elaine and Robert Bennett, never said those words out loud, but their behavior stitched that belief into the fabric of my childhood so tightly that I couldn't tell where their expectations ended and my identity began. Even now, decades later, I can still feel the weight of it, the invisible agreement that if I kept fixing things, I'd eventually be worthy of rest. As a child in our little house near Green Lake in Seattle, I was the one who remembered permission slips, folded laundry, and soothed my mother's sighs when my father's temper rose. My younger sister, Tessa, floated through life like a soap bubble, light, effortless, untouched by responsibility. Mom used to say, "You're lucky to have such a serious big sister looking out for you," as if my anxiety were a gift wrapped in discipline. Every time something went wrong, a misplaced bill, a missed payment, a fight between them, I stepped in to patch the holes. I learned early that being needed was the closest thing I would ever get to being loved. By the time I graduated college, I had perfected the role. My parents called it being reliable. I called it survival. When their mortgage teetered on the edge of default, I transferred my entire savings account to save their home. When Tessa decided to find herself after dropping out of university, I paid off her credit card debt and bought her a used car so she could get a fresh start. When Dad's hours were cut at the docks, I quietly picked up extra freelance work to cover their groceries. It wasn't that they demanded outright. It was subtler than that. A guilt-laced phone call here, a weary sigh there, and "I don't know what we'll do without you" that sounded like affection. To outsiders, we looked close. I sent care packages, remembered birthdays, took them to dinners they couldn't afford. On social media, Mom loved to post photos captioned, "So proud of my girl. She's got everything figured out." She said it like my stability was effortless, like my late nights and skipped meals were luck. I'd smile in those photos, but the truth was I was drowning quietly in their expectations. Even as an adult, the hierarchy remained unspoken but rigid. Tessa was the adored dreamer. She could do no wrong. When she flitted between jobs, Mom called it exploring her passions. When I got promoted, they barely acknowledged it. Once, at a family dinner, Dad clinked his glass and said, "Tessa's always had such a creative soul. We never have to worry about her." I remember laughing too loudly, pretending I didn't hear the irony. But the real betrayal wasn't in their words, it was in their dependence. Every month, I sent that automatic $500 transfer, telling myself it was just until they got back on their feet. But temporary in my family had a way of becoming permanent. When I'd forget to send it on time, Mom would text, "Is everything okay?" We were counting on that for groceries, as though my paycheck existed to feed them first and me second. The guilt was a current that never stopped pulling. What made it complicated was that part of me genuinely loved helping them. I'm not sure if that's love or conditioning. Maybe both. There's a strange satisfaction in being the dependable one and watching chaos calm under your touch. But the cost is high. You start mistaking exhaustion for purpose. You stop expecting reciprocity because you've never known it. After I had the twins, the pattern intensified. Even before they were born, my parents asked how I planned to keep up with my responsibilities once I had those babies. They never said our responsibilities, just mine. I had chosen IVF to become a single mother by choice, and instead of pride or excitement, my mother's first reaction had been a sharp, "Well, I hope you can still afford to help us once they come." I nodded because I didn't know how to explain that love shouldn't always cost something. When Lily and Pearl arrived, I thought their birth might soften my parents. I imagined my mother cradling them, my father assembling their cribs, Tessa finally stepping up as an aunt. But old habits don't fade when they've been rewarded for decades. Instead, my parents visited only when it was convenient, bringing grocery lists or laundry they wanted me to run. They held the babies briefly, then drifted back to their own concerns. I kept sending money, even as my maternity leave shrank my savings. I bought formula in bulk, then groceries for them when Mom called crying about the price of gas. Every time I told myself, this is what family does, but each transfer chipped a little more away from something I didn't realize was finite. My belief that giving would one day be returned. Still, I tried to justify it. Maybe they loved differently. Maybe their generation saw money as connection. Maybe one day, when I truly needed them, they'd show up. That was the thought that kept me going. When I confided in my colleague at work, she asked, "Mara, when's the last time someone did something for you?" I didn't know how to answer. The silence that followed was embarrassing in its truth. The more I thought about it, the more I saw the pattern. My parents loved my usefulness, not my vulnerability. They praised my competence, but recoiled from my needs. I was the safety net, never the one allowed to fall. My mother often said, "You've always been so self-sufficient. It's your gift." But self-sufficiency is just loneliness in a nicer dress. Sometimes at night, after the twins were asleep, I'd stand by the window watching the lights shimmer across Lake Union, and I'd imagine what it would feel like to need nothing from anyone, to live a life free of owing or being owed. Then the phone would buzz, another small crisis, another favor, and I'd pick up because that's what I was trained to do. Looking back now, I can see the irony. I kept believing I was their protector, but the truth is I was their crutch. They leaned on me so hard that I forgot how to stand without their weight pressing down. And the more they leaned, the less they respected the ground I stood on. That's the cruel thing about being the family anchor. No one notices when you start to sink. I don't think my parents were intentionally cruel. They simply loved in the only way they knew, through dependence. They believed that needing me was connection. They didn't understand that love without empathy becomes extraction. I excused it for years because I feared what would remain if I stopped justifying it. But sometimes, the universe forces your eyes open in one violent flash. That call from my doctor, the one that confirmed the tumor, wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a mirror, showing me exactly how fragile my support system really was. And as I stood there, staring at my phone before calling them, I realized that all the years of financial help, all the quiet sacrifices, all the swallowed pride hadn't earned me what I thought they would: the right to ask for care. When the moment came to test whether love ran both ways, my entire history with them condensed into a single, haunting question. Had I raised my parents to believe I didn't need love at all? That question echoed through every memory, through every thank you that sounded like obligation, through every night I went to bed telling myself I was strong when what I really was alone. And the cruelest part? I still hoped they'd prove me wrong. The morning I called my parents to ask for help, the rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Seattle felt washed out, the air thick with that metallic scent before another downpour. I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by baby bottles, my laptop open with half-finished work slides, the twins' soft breathing coming through the monitor. Everything in my life was noise, gentle, relentless, exhausting noise. When the phone rang at 8:03 a.m. and I heard my doctor's voice confirming the surgery date, it was as if the world stopped for a heartbeat and then rushed back twice as loud. "We'll need you here tomorrow morning, Mara." "It can't wait," she said. Tomorrow. Not next week. Not when it was convenient. Tomorrow. I had prepared for the logistics of illness the way I'd prepared for everything. Responsibly, methodically. I'd arranged my insurance, cleared my schedule, packed a hospital bag. What I hadn't planned for was the absence of anyone to lean on. My mind went first to the practical. Who would watch Lily and Pearl? The twins were only 8 months old. Leaving them with strangers for even a few hours felt unthinkable. My parents were the obvious choice. They loved to call themselves doting grandparents at dinner parties. Surely, I thought, this was the kind of moment family existed for. I dialed my mother, Elaine, before I could second guess it. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and distracted. "Sweetheart, we were just looking at tickets online. There's this amazing deal for the Adele concert tomorrow night. Front row." I hesitated. "That's actually why I'm calling, Mom. I need surgery tomorrow morning. They found a tumor, and the doctor says it can't wait." The pause on the line was long enough for my heart to start pounding. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted, lighter, like she was brushing away an inconvenience. "Oh, honey, that's awful timing. Tomorrow? We've had these tickets for months. Your sister is finally free that weekend. Can't the surgery be delayed a bit?" I gripped the phone tighter. "No, Mom, it can't. It's not elective. It's serious." In the background, I heard my father's voice, Robert, muffled but clear enough. "Is she being dramatic again? Tell her she always jumps to the worst-case scenario." The words landed with the dull familiarity of déjà vu. Dramatic, overreacting, the family problem. I felt my stomach tighten. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound calm, "I'm not being dramatic. It's a tumor. They're removing it in less than 24 hours. "Well," he said, his tone sharp now, "we can't just cancel plans every time you have a situation. You're always so demanding about your timing." Demanding. The word stung more than it should have. For years, I'd organized their bills, paid their debts, sent groceries to their door. And now, asking them to watch their grandchildren for a single morning was too much to ask. I tried again, softer this time. "I wouldn't ask if it weren't an emergency. I just need a few hours. Please." My mother sighed. "You always make things sound so urgent, Mara. We've already promised Tessa we'd go. She'll be heartbroken if we back out. And honestly, I can't handle hospitals. They make me anxious. You'll be fine. You always are." The sentence hit harder than any diagnosis. "You'll be fine. You always are." It was the family's motto for me, the way they absolved themselves of responsibility. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. The twins stirred in their cribs, their soft coos filling the room, and I realized I couldn't afford to break down. Not in front of them. Not again. So I did what I've always done. I made it work. I called a 24-hour emergency childcare service, explaining through tears that I needed someone trustworthy experienced with infants. The woman on the other end spoke kindly, her professionalism steadying me. Within an hour, she had found a sitter named Hannah who could come first thing in the morning. The cost was staggering, almost $300 for the day, but I didn't hesitate. You can't put a price on peace of mind, even when it's temporary. That night, I packed the twins' overnight bags, labeling every bottle, every blanket. On each crib, I taped a note: feeding times, allergies, favorite lullabies. I wanted whoever was watching them to feel like they knew my girls, even if only for a few hours. As I worked, I told myself I wasn't angry, just disappointed. But anger has a way of disguising itself as exhaustion. When morning came, the hospital lights were too bright, the smell of antiseptic too sharp. Hannah arrived early, calm and capable. My neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, peeked her head out from her apartment as I left. "You going somewhere, mija?" she asked, noticing the overnight bag. "Just a surgery. Nothing to worry about," I lied. Her wrinkled hand squeezed my arm. "I'll check on your little ones while you're gone. Don't you worry." That simple promise made my throat tighten. My parents hadn't even asked what time the surgery was scheduled. But this woman, nearly a stranger, offered comfort without hesitation. In pre-op, as the nurse adjusted my IV, she asked, "Will family be waiting for you after?" I hesitated, then said, "No, but my daughters will be okay. That's what matters." The nurse smiled gently, but her eyes softened with something close to pity. "You're strong," she said. I wanted to tell her that being called strong sometimes feels like a curse, that it means people stop seeing your pain, but the anesthesia was already creeping in. My last thought before the world went dark was of Lily and Pearl, their small hands reaching for me, and of my mother's voice dismissing me like a child. When I woke up in recovery, the first sensation was relief. It was over, and the tumor was benign. The second was an emptiness I couldn't name. My phone buzzed on the bedside table. For one stupid, hopeful moment, I thought it might be my parents checking in. It wasn't. It was Tessa. A photo lit up the screen, her smiling face under the concert lights, makeup perfect, eyes glittering. The caption read, "Adele was life-changing. Mom and Dad are in tears. You would have loved it." I stared at the picture until my vision blurred. Behind her, I could see my mother's silhouette, head tilted toward the stage, and my father's arm draped over the seat beside her. They looked happy, whole, unbothered. For years, I'd told myself that my sacrifices meant something, that love was an exchange, a circle that always came back around. But lying in that hospital bed, watching their joy unfold on my screen, I understood the truth. Love without reciprocity isn't love at all. It's labor. The nurse came in to check my vitals, asking if I was in pain. I almost said yes, but it wasn't the kind of pain medicine could touch. That night, when Mrs. Wesley Alvarez stopped by the hospital to bring soup and an update on the twins, I cried for the first time in years. She told me that the girls were peaceful, that Hannah had done well, and that she'd peeked in every hour to make sure everything was all right. She'd even sung them a lullaby in Spanish, the same one she used to sing to her own children decades ago. It struck me then how love can come from unexpected corners. How sometimes strangers show up with the kind of care your family never offered. When I finally returned home, I opened my phone again, half hoping for a message, a missed call, something. There was nothing. Just the same concert photos, the same silence. That was the moment something broke in me. Not my heart, that had cracked long ago, but the part of me that kept hoping they'd change. In its place was a cold, clean resolve. I didn't yet know what form it would take, what decisions it would demand, but I knew this. I would never beg for love again. The surgery had removed more than a tumor. It had excised an illusion, the belief that family would always be there when it mattered most. Sometimes the most painful healing comes not from what doctors remove, but from what you finally decide to stop carrying. When I woke from the anesthesia, the world was a blur of pale green curtains and antiseptic light. For a few seconds, I couldn't remember where I was or why the hum of machines around me sounded so alien. Then the memory returned in fragments. The tumor, the surgery, the phone call, my mother's voice saying, "You'll be fine. You always are." My throat tightened, though I couldn't tell if it was from the breathing tube or the weight of her words still echoing inside me. A nurse adjusted the blanket around my shoulders, tucking it gently as though I were something fragile. "You're doing great, Miss Bennett," she said softly. "Your vitals are strong. The surgery went smoothly." I nodded, too tired to respond. She smiled and added, "Your neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, dropped off a cardigan and some soup. She said to tell you the girls are fine." That single sentence cracked something open in me. Mrs. Alvarez, my 70-year-old neighbor with silver hair pinned in a bun and the habit of leaving flowers by my door, had checked on my daughters. Not my parents, not my sister, but a woman who owed me nothing beyond the courtesy of shared walls. I felt tears slip down my temples into my hairline, hot and silent. Gratitude, grief, and something else I couldn't name, something like clarity. When the nurse left, I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what my parents were doing at that very moment. Probably still basking in the afterglow of the concert, posting photos, laughing over late-night snacks. I wanted to believe they'd call eventually, maybe after sleeping in, maybe once the hangover of guilt settled. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't. They had already moved on. The next afternoon, as I sat up in bed eating cold hospital pudding, I opened my phone. I told myself I was checking emails, but really I was searching for any sign that my family had thought of me. Nothing from Mom. Nothing from Dad. My screen, however, lit up with a series of messages from Tessa, all of them about Adele. The first text read, "Oh my God, you would have cried, Mara. She sang Love in the Dark." The next, "Mom was so emotional. She said this was her favorite night ever." Then a video of them all smiling in the crowd. The stage lights painted their faces in gold. I turned the volume up and heard my mother's voice in the background. "Mara will be fine. She always is." Those words again. casual, dismissive, final. I set the phone face down on the blanket. For years, I'd told myself that family love just looked different, that maybe my parents showed care in ways I didn't always recognize. But in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by strangers who'd shown me more kindness in 2 days than my family had in years, that illusion dissolved completely. When Mrs. Alvarez came by later that evening, carrying a thermos of homemade chicken soup, she scolded me gently. "You look like a ghost, mija. Eat." She sat beside my bed, telling stories about her grandchildren in San Diego, how she missed the sound of little feet in her hallway. Her presence filled the space with something steady and warm. Before leaving, she pressed my hand. "Don't worry about the babies. Hannah is wonderful. I've checked on them every few hours. They are happy." After she left, I pulled my journal from the hospital nightstand. I hadn't written in months, but the words poured out like water breaking through a dam. I wrote about the soup, the cardigan, the way Mrs. Alvarez called me Mija, as if she had claimed me into her care without needing permission. I wrote about the silence from my parents and the dull ache of realizing it was no longer surprising. And then I began a letter to my daughters. "Dear Lily and Pearl," I wrote, "if you ever doubt what love looks like, remember this. Love shows up. It doesn't wait until it's convenient. It doesn't vanish when it's uncomfortable. Real love holds your hand in the ugly moments, the ones without applause." My handwriting trembled, and I had to pause. I thought of all the times I'd modeled the opposite lesson, telling myself that giving endlessly was noble, that being indispensable was the same as being loved. But what had that taught them? That their worth would depend on how much they could offer others? I couldn't let that legacy pass through me to them. I wanted them to know love that was reciprocal, tender, and brave enough to show up when it mattered. When I was discharged the next morning, the air outside felt different. Cooler, sharper, alive with the scent of rain-soaked pavement. I called an Uber and rode home with my bag in my lap, watching the skyline blur past. The Space Needle glinted in the distance, indifferent and magnificent. I thought about how I'd spent my whole life trying to earn the kind of love that should have been freely given. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted it anymore. At home, the apartment was quiet, except for the rhythmic sound of the twins breathing in their sleep. Hannah had tidied up, folded blankets, and left a note on the counter that said, "You have 2 angels. Get some rest." I placed an envelope of cash beside her note, payment plus a thank you. Then I went to the nursery and stood watching Lily and Pearl, their tiny fists curled near their faces, completely unaware of how close I'd come to breaking. I knelt between their cribs and whispered, "You're safe. I promise I'll keep you safe." It wasn't just a mother's vow, it was a declaration to myself. Safe from the cycle. Safe from the quiet hunger of being needed but not loved. Safe from the kind of family loyalty that drains instead of fills. That evening, Mrs. Alvarez knocked softly and brought over a small pot of flowers. "For your windowsill," she said. "They like morning light." I thanked her, my throat thick with emotion. I wanted to tell her that she had done more for me in 48 hours than my own parents had in a lifetime, but the words wouldn't come. So I hugged her instead, and she patted my back like I was her own daughter. When she left, I sat by the window holding the little pot. The petals were pale yellow, fragile yet persistent. Outside, the city glowed against the dark water, and I realized that healing rarely arrives as grand epiphany. Sometimes it comes disguised as small acts of kindness, someone bringing soup, checking on your children, leaving flowers by your door. That night, as I lay in bed with the twins asleep beside me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stillness. No buzzing phone, no guilt hovering at the edges of my mind, no tightrope of obligation waiting to snap. Just me, my daughters, and the faint sound of rain against the window. I thought about calling my parents one last time, just to say the surgery went well, to see if they'd ask how I was. But I didn't. The silence between us no longer needed filling. It had become its own kind of truth, a mirror I could finally look into without flinching. Before drifting to sleep, I reopened my journal and finished the letter to Lily and Pearl. "Love," I wrote, "is not measured by how much you give away. It's measured by who stays when you have nothing left to offer." When I put the pen down, I felt lighter. The surgery had removed a tumor, yes, But it had also revealed something deeper and more insidious that had been growing inside me for years: the belief that love must be earned. That night, I decided to let that belief die too. In its place, something new began to grow, quietly, cautiously, like a flower leaning toward light. It wasn't forgiveness yet, and it wasn't peace. It was simply awareness. The kind that hums in your bones when you finally understand that family isn't defined by blood or obligation. It's defined by presence, by care freely given, by people who show up even when there's nothing in it for them. And as I drifted into sleep with my daughter's soft breaths beside me, I knew that maybe, for the first time in my life, I had found family, after all. The morning after I returned home from the hospital, the world seemed sharper, as though someone had adjusted the focus on my life. Light filtered through the curtains in soft bands, illuminating the outlines of the twins' cribs. Lily stirred first, her tiny hand curling and uncurling like a wave, while Pearl lay still, her lips forming that faint, dream-born smile that always reminded me how innocent trust could look. I stood there for a long time, watching them breathe, feeling a pulse of gratitude that was heavier than joy but quieter than grief. I was alive. The tumor was gone. Yet something deeper inside me had been cut out too, the part that kept believing I had to earn love to deserve it. When I walked into the kitchen, the apartment was still, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. On the counter, my phone blinked with unread messages, all from unknown numbers. I didn't open them. I already knew the pattern. My parents reaching out in ways that weren't apologies, but reminders of their importance. My chest tightened, but not with fear, something closer to resolve. For years, I had lived in a state of constant management. Their bills, their emotions, their disappointments. I'd been the daughter who handled everything, who quietly absorbed the chaos so that no one else had to face it. But standing in my kitchen, still sore from surgery, I felt something uncoiling inside me. A realization that the life I was maintaining wasn't really mine. I opened my laptop and signed into my bank account. The familiar line of automated payments glowed on the screen. $500 to my parents on the 15th of every month. Rent, daycare, utilities, groceries. It was all there, lined up like proof of my own predictability. My hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. Canceling that transfer felt like touching a live wire. But when I clicked the button and saw the confirmation, recurring payment canceled, a quiet rush went through me, like air finally filling lungs that had been starved for years. Next, I opened the grocery app and deleted their address. Then I called the credit card company to cancel the extra card I'd given them for emergencies. The representative asked if I wanted to issue a replacement. No, I said. Not anymore. Each small act of separation felt like dismantling a web I hadn't realized was strangling me. For the first time, my decisions were about my daughters and me, not about preserving a version of family that had only ever existed in my imagination. Afterward, I stood at the sink, rinsing a bottle, the morning sun turning the water into ribbons of light. I expected to feel guilt, but what came instead was a strange stillness. I thought about all the years I'd equated sacrifice with goodness, as if being drained made me noble. But there's nothing sacred about disappearing for someone else's comfort. Later that day, Mrs. Alvarez knocked on my door holding a bowl of rice pudding. "You need sweetness," she said simply. We sat at the table and I told her, haltingly at first, about my parents, about the concert, about the years of being the family's safety net. She listened without interruption, her hands folded, eyes soft but steady. When I finished, she said, "You can love people and still leave them behind when staying means losing yourself. That's not cruelty, Mija. That's wisdom." Her words sank into me like water into parched soil. That evening, after putting the twins to bed, I sat on the couch with a notebook and made 2 columns. On one side, I wrote, "What I owe." On the other, "What I choose." Under "What I owe," I listed everything my parents had ever implied I was responsible for. Their bills, their happiness, their image, their comfort. Under "What I choose," I wrote just 2 words, my peace. I tore out the page and pinned it to the fridge. It felt symbolic, like leaving a note for the version of myself that had always needed permission. Over the next few days, I began to build small rituals around reclaiming space. Every morning, I brewed coffee just for me, not gulped between tasks, but sipped while watching the sunrise over Elliott Bay. I took the twins out in their stroller and walked along the Alki Trail, the air briny and cold, the gulls crying above the water. With each step, I repeated a quiet mantra. You are not responsible for their choices. At work, when my boss suggested I take more time to recover, I said yes instead of brushing it off. I'd spent years pushing through exhaustion to prove I could handle anything. Now, I didn't want to prove anything. I wanted to feel. One night, as I rocked Pearl back to sleep, her small fingers wrapped around mine, and I realized that everything I'd been chasing, approval, belonging, love, was already here, in this quiet room, in the soft rhythm of her breathing against my chest. I didn't need my parents' validation to know I was worthy. I just needed to stop confusing endurance with love. Still, the transformation wasn't seamless. Guilt is a tenacious ghost. It doesn't vanish just because you've exorcised its cause. There were moments, late at night, when I'd reach for my phone instinctively, ready to call my mother and tell her I was okay. But then I'd remember her voice from that phone call, the careless tone, the refusal, and my hand would still. The real turning point came a week later. I was sitting at my desk, paying bills, when I realized that for the first time in years, my paycheck would stay mine. No transfers, no quiet resentments. Just money that could go toward a future that belonged to us. I opened a new savings account and named it Lily and Pearl's Tomorrow. I moved the $500 there and watched the numbers change. It was small, but it was the start of something honest, a life built on care, not obligation. That night, I cooked myself a real dinner. Not cereal, not leftovers eaten standing by the sink. I made salmon with lemon and roasted vegetables. As the twins babbled in their high chairs, I felt something like joy rise up in me, uninvited but welcome. It wasn't the loud, movie kind of joy. It was quiet, grounded, real. After cleaning up, I stepped out onto the balcony. The city shimmered in the distance, rain misting against the glass. I thought about my parents, about how they would eventually notice the missing money, the canceled card, the silence. There would be phone calls, guilt-laden messages, maybe even visits. But the difference now was that I wouldn't answer out of fear. I would answer, or not, out of choice. I realized that love without boundaries isn't love. It's servitude, and I was done serving a story that kept erasing me. Inside, the twins had fallen asleep, their faces soft with trust. I looked at them and whispered, "You will never have to wonder if you're enough." It wasn't a promise I made lightly. It was one I carved from the ruins of every time I'd been told the opposite. Before going to bed, I wrote one last sentence in my journal. Today, I chose myself, and nothing terrible happened. It was such a simple truth, yet it felt revolutionary. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in reaction to someone else's need. I was living in alignment with my own. That night, sleep came easily. The rain softened to a whisper outside, and as I drifted off, I felt the quiet hum of possibility, the sense that I'd stepped out of a life that had been shrinking me and into one that might finally let me breathe. The next morning, I woke before the twins. The apartment was still, the light gray and gentle. I poured a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the sky blush pink over the sound. I didn't know what would come next, what storms, what reckonings, but I knew this much. I would never again beg for love that came with conditions. I had finally learned that choosing yourself isn't abandonment. It's returning home. The first week after I cut off the financial support was strangely quiet, almost suspiciously peaceful. No calls, no texts, no emails from my parents or from Tessa. The silence felt like a fragile glass dome I was living inside. One sharp sound could shatter it. For the first time in years, my evenings belonged to me. I bathed the twins, read them stories, and fell asleep without the familiar hum of anxiety about someone else's problems. But peace has a way of making people uncomfortable, especially those who've grown used to your chaos, keeping their lives stable. It was a Thursday evening when the knocking started. It was sharp, impatient, the kind of pounding that carried authority, as though the person on the other side believed they still had the right to demand entry. I was in the kitchen feeding Pearl when the first knock came, followed by Lily's cry echoing from the nursery. My stomach tightened. I didn't have to look through the peephole to know who it was. "Mara, it's me," Tessa's voice called out. She sounded desperate, breathless. "Please open the door. We need to talk. It's important." The twins began to fuss. I carried them both into the living room, settling them on a blanket before I even considered responding. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the ache of old habits, my instinct to fix, to soothe, to surrender. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. She was standing there, hair tangled, mascara smudged, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. Behind her, the rain fell in soft sheets, catching the yellow glow of the hallway light. "Please, Mara," she said again, her voice cracking. "Mom and Dad are freaking out. They said you've stopped sending money. They don't know what to do." I kept the chain locked and cracked the door open only an inch. "You're right," I said quietly. "I stopped. That's not my responsibility anymore." Her eyes widened, confusion flashing across her face. "What are you talking about? You've been helping them for years. They rely on you. We all rely on you." The way she said "we" struck me. The entitlement in it, so casual it almost sounded innocent. I took a deep breath. "I asked them for help when I needed surgery, Tessa. They went to a concert instead. That's not family. That's convenience." She blinked, shifting from pleading to defensive. "You're still upset about that? They just didn't know how serious it was. You're being dramatic again." That word again, dramatic, fell between us like poison. I felt my pulse in my throat, the old anger rising. They knew exactly how serious it was. I told them it was a tumor, that I was going into surgery the next morning, and they chose front row tickets over their daughter. She crossed her arms, shivering in her thin sweater. "You can't hold that against them forever. Mom has anxiety about hospitals, and Dad, well, he said you always make things sound worse than they are." I let out a small laugh, bitter and sharp. "Do you hear yourself? You're excusing abandonment. You're trying to make it make sense so you don't have to see what's really happening." Her expression hardened. "You can't just cut them off, Mara. They're our parents. You're being selfish." The word landed, but it didn't pierce. Not anymore. For years, that accusation had been my leash. Every act of self-preservation labeled as selfishness. Every attempt to draw a boundary painted as betrayal. But now, standing there with the twins babbling softly behind me, I realized that selfishness and self-respect sometimes wear the same face. "I'm not being selfish," I said, my voice steady. "I'm being sane. I'm choosing peace for myself and for my daughters. They will not grow up thinking love means constant sacrifice." Tessa's lower lip trembled, but I could see calculation behind her eyes. "If Dad apologizes, will you reconsider? Maybe if Mom calls too? They just need some time to cool off." Apologies as currency. That was our family's language. Say sorry, not because you mean it, but because it resets the cycle and opens the wallet again. I studied her face and saw the same manipulation dressed up as concern. "This isn't about apologies," I said softly. "This is about me finally believing their actions over their words." She took a small step forward, pressing against the door. "You can't do this, Mara. They're scared. They don't know how to survive without your help." They should have thought of that before treating me like their safety net instead of their daughter. Something in my tone must have reached her, because her expression shifted from pleading to anger. "You think you're better than us now, don't you? With your job, your apartment, your picture-perfect twins. You've always looked down on us, acting like you're the only responsible one." I exhaled slowly. "I don't think I'm better, Tessa. I think I'm done being broken." For a moment, we both stood there, the rain a steady rhythm behind her. Then she said quietly, "They'll lose the house, you know. Dad already missed 2 payments." The old reflex tugged at me. Worry, responsibility, guilt. But it was a reflex I could now name and resist. "I hope they find a way through it," I said simply. "But I'm not their solution anymore." Her face twisted, disbelief turning to fury. "You're heartless." "No," I said, closing the door an inch further, my voice low but clear. "I'm healing." I heard her inhale sharply, as if the word itself offended her. She pressed one more time, softer now. "Mom cries every night. She says she doesn't even recognize you anymore." "She never really knew me," I whispered. "She only knew what I could give." I closed the door then, locking it gently. Tessa knocked twice more, then fell silent. I stood there, hand resting on the doorknob, listening to the muffled sound of her footsteps retreating down the hallway, the elevator doors closing. When the apartment was quiet again, I turned back to the twins. They were both watching me from the blanket, wide-eyed, sensing the tension that still hung in the air. I knelt down, picked up Lily, and kissed her forehead. "It's okay," I said softly. "Mommy's learning how to be strong in a different way." Later that night, I made tea and sat by the window. The city outside was hushed, lights shimmering across the wet pavement. My hands shook slightly as I lifted the cup. Confrontation had never been my language. I'd always been fluent in compliance. But boundaries have their own kind of fluency, a language that feels foreign at first but grows familiar with every sentence you speak. I thought about what Tessa had said, about the house, about my mother crying. The images tried to dig into me like hooks, but I refused to let them anchor. Their suffering wasn't mine to solve anymore. Love had become synonymous with rescue in our family, and it was killing us all in different ways. By the time I finished my tea, I felt an unexpected calm settle in. Maybe this was what freedom actually looked like, not the absence of conflict, but the willingness to endure its noise without collapsing. The next morning, I woke to a message from Tessa. "I hope you're happy. They're devastated. I tried." I didn't reply. I deleted it and went about the day, feeding the twins, answering work emails, folding laundry, mundane things, grounding things. I found comfort in the rhythm of ordinary life. Around noon, Mrs. Alvarez stopped by with a bag of fresh bread. "Rough night?" she asked, reading my face. I smiled faintly. "Family visit." She nodded knowingly. Sometimes the hardest part of growing is letting the noise fade. You did the right thing. That night, as I tucked Lily and Pearl into their cribs, I realized that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through locked doors and unanswered calls, through the quiet conviction that you are allowed to protect your peace. And though the guilt still lingered, like an old bruise, I knew I would not reopen the wound just to keep others comfortable. I had finally learned that love cannot survive where boundaries are forbidden. The days that followed Tessa's visit felt like a strange kind of limbo, quiet but charged, as if the air itself was waiting for something to break. My phone sat on the kitchen counter like a dormant bomb, lighting up every so often with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. The silence that once felt foreign was now becoming familiar, almost comforting. It wasn't emptiness. It was space. For years, I hadn't had any. Every inch of my life had been occupied by someone else's needs, someone else's emergencies. Now there was room to breathe. But silence, I learned, has layers. There's the peaceful kind that feels like sunlight on water, and then there's the kind that hums beneath your ribs, reminding you that freedom can still ache. I'd spent so long defining myself by what I did for others that not doing it felt like losing gravity. Yet every time I started to waver, I'd look at Lily and Pearl, at their small hands reaching for me without expectation, and I knew I was finally building something solid, something mine. About a week after Tessa showed up, a letter appeared under my door. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. Sharp, deliberate, the kind of penmanship that tried too hard to look controlled. I didn't open it. Instead, I placed it on the kitchen counter beside the unpaid electricity bill he'd once mailed me as a hint. Every morning I'd pass it, my curiosity sparking and fading like a match. What could it possibly say? Apologies laced with blame? A list of reasons I owed them forgiveness? Maybe a reminder of all they'd sacrificed. But whatever it was, I knew it wasn't what I needed. So the envelope stayed there, gathering dust, a monument to restraint. One afternoon, I came home from work to find Mrs. Alvarez waiting by my door with a plate of empanadas. "There were people knocking earlier," she said softly. "A man and a woman, looked a little desperate. I told them you weren't home." My stomach tightened. "My parents," I said, though it wasn't a question. She nodded. "They left something on the mat. I didn't touch it." It was another envelope, larger this time, sealed with the kind of urgency guilt creates. I bent down, picked it up, and turned it over in my hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have. I wanted to throw it away right then, but instead I placed it next to the first one. 2 silent witnesses to a lifetime of unspoken expectations. For the next few days, the knocking returned at odd hours, soft at first, then harder, angrier. I never answered. The twins would startle, their cries echoing through the apartment, and I'd hold them close, whispering until they calmed. Each time, I promised myself that they would never grow up learning that love required endurance. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The letters disappeared, and with their absence came a silence that felt final. Not the pause before an apology, but the kind that comes when people realize they've lost control. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. The following week, I got an email from my bank. Unusual activity detected on account ending in 4782. My heart stuttered. That was the joint account I'd once been listed on for my parents' emergency fund, the one I thought I'd been removed from years ago. When I called the bank, the representative confirmed what I already suspected. "The account is overdrawn," she said gently. "Several payments bounced this week. You're still listed as an emergency contact." I closed my eyes. "Please remove me immediately," I said. "I don't want to be associated with that account in any way." She hesitated. "Are you sure, Miss Bennett? You'll lose access to notifications if—" "I'm sure," I interrupted. My voice didn't shake this time. When the call ended, I felt no panic, no urge to fix anything. I remembered how, in the past, that kind of news would have sent me spiraling, pulling out my calculator, moving money, rewriting my own future to save theirs. Now, all I felt was relief. Their emergencies were no longer mine. A few days later, Tessa tried again, this time through text. "They're staying with me. Their electricity got cut off. Please, Mara, they need you. Just talk to them." I stared at the message, feeling the familiar tug of guilt and responsibility, the temptation to step back into the old rhythm. But then I looked up. Lily was toddling across the living room carpet, holding one of Pearl's stuffed animals, her laughter filling the space. That sound, pure, unburdened, was everything I'd been fighting for. I deleted the message without replying. In the quiet that followed, I realized that peace isn't just about silence. It's about what fills it. I started using my evenings differently. Instead of managing crises, I joined a single mother support group at the community center near Green Lake. The first night I went, I almost turned around at the door, convinced I didn't belong. But when I walked in, a woman with kind eyes and a baby strapped to her chest handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You made it. That's the hardest part." The group met every Wednesday, a circle of tired but fierce women trading stories, advice, and laughter. No one asked for more than they could give. There were no guilt trips, no unspoken debts, just mutual understanding. For the first time, I felt what community was supposed to mean. People who show up because they choose to, not because they're entitled to your presence. Around the same time, I enrolled in a financial literacy workshop through my company. I learned to budget not out of fear, but out of intention. I opened a new savings account called the Bennett Girls Fund, and each month I moved the $500 there, the same money that used to disappear into my parents' endless emergencies. Watching the balance grow was like watching myself heal. Work changed too. I'd spent so many years underplaying my own competence that when my boss offered me the lead on a new mentorship program for women returning from parental leave, I hesitated. "You've earned this," she said. "Don't apologize for being capable." I accepted. The project became a lifeline, a way to channel everything I'd learned about resilience into something that built instead of drained. Meanwhile, the calls from my family slowed, then stopped entirely. Every now and then, I'd get a blocked number or a vague voicemail. My father's voice stiff and formal, my mother's tone brittle with indignation. I didn't save them. Letting go of their numbers had been one of the hardest things I'd ever done. But each day without contact felt lighter. Still, there were moments when sadness crept in quietly, disguised as nostalgia. I'd see a father lifting his toddler in the park, or hear someone call their mother just to chat, and something inside me would ache. I'd never had that. I never would. But grief, I learned, can coexist with gratitude. You can mourn what you didn't have and still be thankful for what you do. By late summer, life had settled into a new rhythm. The twins were thriving. Lily had started to say mama, and Pearl loved to dance every time music played. I'd come home from work, scoop them up, and feel the weight of the day melt away. Sometimes I'd stand at the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline, and think about how much of my life I'd spent waiting for my parents' love to feel real. Now, I was learning that love didn't have to come from the people who gave you life. It could come from the ones who helped you live it. One evening, Mrs. Alvarez stopped by with a box of strawberries from the farmer's market. "You look lighter these days," she said, studying me with a smile. I am, I admitted. For the first time, I'm not carrying anyone else's story. She nodded. Good. Now you can write your own. That night, after the twins were asleep, I finally took the 2 envelopes from the counter. I carried them downstairs to the dumpster behind the building. For a moment, I held them over the bin, the rain cool against my skin. Then I let go. The sound they made as they landed was soft, almost anticlimactic, but to me, it sounded like a door closing. When I went back upstairs, the apartment smelled faintly of baby lotion and lavender. I stood in the quiet, listening to my daughters breathe, and felt something deep in my chest unclench. Silence wasn't loneliness anymore. It was strength. It was mine. By autumn, the air in Seattle had shifted. Mornings arrived draped in mist, and evenings settled early, the kind of quiet darkness that asked you to look inward. I'd always loved this season, the way the city smelled of rain and wood smoke, how leaves turned into embers underfoot. But that year, it felt different. I was different. My life, once defined by constant urgency, had softened into something slower, more deliberate. The silence that had once felt like a punishment now felt sacred. Every morning, before waking Lily and Pearl, I stood by the window with my coffee and watched the ferries cross Puget Sound. The water shimmered like liquid silver under the low sun. I used to measure my days by how much I could do for others. Now I measured them by moments like this: steady breaths, small joys, the quiet hum of contentment that came from knowing I was finally living a life of my own making. The twins were growing fast. Pearl had discovered her laugh, a deep, throaty giggle that filled the room like light, and Lily had started to insist on feeding herself, her independence as fierce as her mother's. Every evening, we had our ritual: dinner together, a walk along the Elliott Bay Trail, and then bedtime stories in the rocking chair. I'd tell them stories about brave girls and gentle giants, about kindness that didn't ask for anything in return. But sometimes, when they drifted off to sleep, I'd whisper my own truth into the dimly lit room. You don't have to earn love, my darlings. You already are enough. It had been months since I'd last heard from my parents. The silence, once deafening, had become background noise. I imagined them still struggling, financially, emotionally, but I no longer felt responsible. Love, I realized, didn't mean rescuing someone from the consequences of their choices. It meant respecting the boundary between what is yours to carry and what isn't. That was the legacy I wanted to leave my daughters. One Saturday, I took the twins to the community garden near Green Lake, where families tended small plots together. The soil was damp from overnight rain, dark and rich under my hands. We planted wildflowers, sunflowers, daisies, marigolds, the kinds that didn't ask for much, just sunlight and a little care. As Lily patted the dirt clumsily and Pearl tried to eat a petal, I thought about how symbolic it was, new life taking root where something once lay barren. Gardens grow best when you stop overwatering them, Mrs. Alvarez had told me once. Too much attention can drown even the strongest plants. She was right, of course. I had overwatered every relationship in my past, mistaking control for care, effort for love. Now I was learning to trust that what was meant to bloom would do so naturally. That evening, Mrs. Alvarez came by with a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet engraved with the word resilience. For surviving, she said simply. I hugged her, overwhelmed by the quiet generosity of the gesture. In her presence, I had found the kind of maternal steadiness I'd never received from my own mother. And in caring for me without expectation, she'd shown me the shape of real love: unconditional, present, and profoundly human. At work, the mentorship program I'd launched was thriving. Women returning from parental leave shared stories that mirrored pieces of my own: the fear of being forgotten, the guilt of wanting more than survival. Listening to them, I realized that my pain had become purpose. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was helping others rebuild theirs. Sometimes healing isn't about forgetting what hurt you. It's about turning it into something that helps others feel less alone. Still, there were moments of grief. I'd see a mother and daughter laughing together in a cafe, or hear a colleague talk about her parents visiting for the weekend, and a hollow ache would open quietly inside me. But I no longer tried to fill it with guilt or longing. Some losses, I'd learned, are meant to be honored, not repaired. The absence of my parents' love had carved space for something greater: peace. One cold evening, after putting the twins to bed, I found myself standing on the balcony, the city lights reflected in the wet streets below. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who stayed up past midnight sending money she couldn't spare, who mistook exhaustion for strength, who begged for scraps of affection disguised as obligation. I wanted to tell her that freedom wasn't the absence of pain, but the decision to stop living inside it. The next morning, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The handwriting was unmistakably my father's. For a moment, I just stood there, the envelope cold against my palm. I brought it upstairs, placed it on the table, and made myself breakfast before touching it again. Then, slowly, I opened it. The letter was long, filled with formal language and stilted phrases, apologies that sounded rehearsed, promises to do better, and a closing line that read, "We miss our daughter and hope you'll come home soon." Home. The word lingered, heavy and hollow. Their house had never been home. It had been a place of duties and debts. My home was here, where laughter spilled from cribs and morning light touched the faces of two little girls who loved me without conditions. I folded the letter neatly, walked to the kitchen trash bin, and dropped it inside. No anger, no satisfaction, just release. That afternoon, the twins and I met Mrs. Alvarez at the park. She watched them play in the leaves, her eyes shining. "You're doing beautifully, Mia," she said. "Your girls are happy, and so are you." "I think so," I replied, smiling. "For the first time, I'm not waiting for someone else to give me permission to be." That night, as I tucked the girls into bed, Lily reached up and touched my face with her tiny hand. "Mama," she whispered sleepily, "you're happy." I laughed softly. "I am, baby. I really am." After they fell asleep, I sat at my desk and opened my journal, the same one that had once been filled with fear and confusion. Now the pages held something gentler. I wrote, "Peace is not the absence of people. It's the presence of boundaries, of trust in yourself. It's the decision to stay whole even when others choose to break away." I used to think love was measured by how much I could give. But real love, the kind that lasts, is measured by how fully you can stand in your own life and still open your heart without losing yourself. When I closed the notebook, I felt a stillness that didn't demand explanation. Outside, the rain had started again, soft, rhythmic, familiar. I let it play its quiet song through the night. Months later, the garden by Green Lake bloomed in bursts of yellow and white. The twins ran among the flowers, their laughter carried by the wind, and I felt something in me settle, like a circle finally closing. The woman who had once begged for love was gone. In her place stood someone rooted, whole, alive. Sometimes when people ask what happened to my family, I tell them the truth. They taught me what love isn't, and that might be the most valuable lesson they could have ever given. I don't say it with bitterness anymore, but with gratitude, because in losing them, I found myself. And in finding myself, I gave my daughters the gift I never had, a mother who knows her worth, who understands that peace isn't something you stumble upon, it's something you build, one boundary, one breath, one choice at a time. In the end, Mara Bennett's story became more than a tale about betrayal and broken family ties. It was a journey of awakening. For years, she had been the dependable daughter, the provider, the emotional glue holding her family together. She gave without limits, believing that sacrifice equaled love. But when illness forced her to reach out for help, her parents' refusal shattered that illusion. Their absence during her most vulnerable moment became the catalyst for her transformation. In choosing to walk away, Mara didn't just cut financial ties, she severed the invisible strings of guilt and obligation that had controlled her entire life. Through the silence that followed, she discovered something profound. Peace is not found in pleasing others, but in protecting your own heart. She built a new kind of family, her daughters, her kind neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, and a community that showed love without condition. Mara's strength didn't come from anger or revenge. It came from the quiet courage to say, enough. She learned that love without reciprocity is not love. It's servitude. And by letting go of those who couldn't value her, she finally learned to value herself. The lesson from Mara's story is one many of us need to hear. Setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's an act of self-respect. You can love people deeply and still refuse to let them drain your spirit. Applying this to your own life means asking yourself a simple question. Does this relationship bring peace or pain? If it brings pain more often than peace, it may be time to step back and protect your energy. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Mara's situation, what would you do? A. Keep helping your family out of guilt and duty. B. Walk away and choose peace, even if it means being misunderstood. Comment A or B below and tell us why you chose it. What are your thoughts on Mara's decision? Have you ever had to set a painful boundary in your own life? Share your story in the comments so others can learn from it too. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful real-life stories that touch the heart and heal the soul.